Hi students, by now we have actually finished here some of the very important topics in the osteology of the head and neck, and we have already told you that if you are discussing the osteology of the head and neck, means you are discussing basically the skull. Additionally, two more things, you have cervical vertebrae, first, second, then among the third, fourth, fifth and sixth only one is the typical vertebrae, and then is the seventh cervical vertebra. Additionally, one more, that is the hyoid bone. If you are actually doing all of them together, means osteology of the head and neck is supposed to have been done. But as far the osteology of head and neck is concerned, we are discussing the major portion. You know that almost 95% of this portion is the skull. 5% you can say it is the four bones here on the back side is called the cervical vertebrae, four that you have to do, and one is the hyoid bone. This is 1% each you see of the total quantity of the osteology. But you see here is the skull, and the skull means you have to see the outer features of the skull, means front of the skull, superior view, lateral view, posterior view. At the same time mandible separately you have to do. But not only this, but you have to see here what cavities, fossa and these things are present in your skull also. And among them we have removed the vault of the cranium and discussed the cranial cavity. Then you have to go into the nasal cavity and oral cavity also, but these two structures you will do with the viscera like nose and the mouth. When you will be discussing mouth and say mouth and nose, these cavities will be done there. So they are not supposed to be completed here. But at the same time at the base of the skull, because inferior view of the skull you haven't discussed. So here in the base of the skull, two fossa are very, very important. One is the infratemporal fossa, another is the pterygopalatine fossa. And as far these two fossa are concerned, we have some other cavities or accommodations also. One is within the petrous part of temporal bone, that is the ear, that will be done with the ear. But here this is another socket, or you see another cavity which is present here, that is called the bony orbit. Bony orbit must be completed here. Better is this, because you have already done all or most of the bones already you have become familiar with. So this is the best time you should actually complete the bony orbit. Otherwise bony orbit could have been done when we are doing the eyeball, but better is that the bony orbit should be actually done with the skull here. So here our today's topic here is the bony orbit. Now bony orbit, you see this is the orbit, or it is a socket in which eyeball and other structures related to the eyeball, neurovascular bundles, orbital fate, fascia of the eyeball, they are actually lying inside that orbit. But you see the orbit where eyeball is located, and almost half the cranial nerves, they are in fact directed, or they are subserving the eyeball here. More than you see that almost 6 nerves out of 12, means half the number of nerves in fact they are allocated for just the eyeball. So all these nerves, it's not just the nerves, but will be obviously some lymphatics also, arteries as well, and you have the venous drainage also. All these things you know that will have to enter or leave the orbit through certain fissure and foramina and many other things also. Not only all these structures which are directed towards the eyeball which are entering here into the orbit, but many structures which will try to come here onto the front of your front of your head, this is called the face here, in the forehead region if they are coming, or in the lower region here to the lip even, if they want to actually go and want to reach these areas also, they will pass through the orbit also. Not necessarily all the structures which are entering into the orbit through certain fissures and foramina, they will be directed or they are subserving the your eyeball only. No, they want to access your face here. That's why they are passing. These structures are lying here. So the orbit is actually in the middle portion, is a very, very important, and I believe that here will be almost 8 or 9 important gateways will be, or the exit or entrance points will in fact you will be finding here in the orbit. And as far your orbit is concerned, you will see that when you will actually put your put a wax, for example, you put a wax in the orbit here and fill the orbit up to the surface, and when you will actually get the wax out here, the shape of this wax will be like a pyramid. Means it will be like this. You see, if you are actually bringing it like this, its shape will be like this. The wax which you are filling the orbit, you see this whole wax which you are actually filling the orbit with, if you are getting the wax out here, it will mold itself in such a way, it will mold itself according to the shape of the orbit, according to the space of the orbit here. and it will be bringing it out, it will look like here. This indicates that the base of the orbit is broader and the depth of the orbit means the bottom will be narrower. And if you are actually looking at it, it's like this. Now, if you will see that, first of all, if you actually want to understand the orbit in a better way, you should think that which bones are constituting the walls of the orbit. You see the bones forming the walls of the orbit, these are those bones, almost all of these bones are those which are forming the facial skeleton also. Means if it is a frontal bone comes here, forms the upper orbital margin, this is called the superior orbital margin, and turns inside and it will form the roof of the orbit. Here, this is the maxilla, it is forming the facial part, you see that here is the middle part of the face. We reaches here, it is forming the inferior orbital margin, turns inside and forms here the floor of the orbit. Here this is zygomatic bone, and zygomatic bone is forming here the cheekbone. This is forming here one very important stout part of your face here. When it reaches here, it is forming the lateral wall of your say lateral margin of the orbit, turns inside, forms the lateral wall of the orbit here. So that means these are the facial bones, but not all the facial bones you see, these three facial bones especially, maxilla, and you have seen here the frontal bone, zygomatic bone, they are forming orbital margins and turning inside to form the walls of the orbit surely, but they will not reach the maximum, you see, they will not reach the extreme depth of the orbit here. And extreme depth, if they are not reaching there, so that means that deficiencies where they cannot reach, that deficiencies will be filled by certain other bones which are not appearing here on the face. Means these bones in fact will be present there also. That's why these things you will actually be watching here. So that means at least these three bones which you have seen here, their important landmarks you should actually note here. Then and then you will be able to understand how the walls and different boundaries of the orbit are formed here. See, this is the red color which we are actually showing you here, this. See this one here. This is the frontal bones. These are the margins of frontal bone I am telling you here. This all is the frontal bone. If this is all is the frontal bone, means this frontal bone here is forming the forehead. And the frontal bone is forming here the forehead. When this frontal bone comes down here, it reaches here. Means it is forming the superior orbital margin. And when it is a superior orbital margin has been formed here, so you see that not just it is reaching here, but after that it reflects inside, means bends inside, and bends inside, you see this one here, this one. Bends inside, so means it has gone inside. Inside it has gone, this indicates that inside it has gone, it is forming now the roof of the orbit here. And this is the roof of the orbit, this is actually called here the roof of the orbit, this is the orbital plate of the frontal bone. If you remember, this is forming the roof of orbit. And incidentally, this is forming on the cranial cavity the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. And if you have seen previously also in the cranial cavity, the anterior cranial fossa, most of the floor is actually formed here by the orbital plate of frontal bone. That was forming there the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Similarly, on the under surface will be forming here the roof of the orbit here. So this one, it is called the orbital plate of the frontal bone. So orbital plate of the frontal bone is this. This is frontal bone and this is the orbital plate of frontal bone, forming most of the roof here. Little bit medial wall also, little bit, you see less than 10%, a little bit lateral wall also. Because we have four walls, roof, floor, medial wall, lateral wall. But because we have the four walls, but there are three bones which are contributing. Means each bone will form its own boundary, means here the superior boundary, I say the roof, but it will be little bit forming, contributing in the lateral, medial and the lateral walls also. Because we have three bones, not the four. Not each bone will be for the one wall, that will contribute in some other walls also, the adjacent walls here. It is superior, there is a roof, so little bit lateral, a little bit medial also. Then the rest of the lateral will be taken over by the zygomatic bone, and the zygomatic bone will be forming the lateral wall. Surely the rest of the lateral means 90%, and that will actually forming here the floor also. And the rest of the floor will be formed here by the maxilla, and it will also be coming here under the medial side also. So this is something that you are actually watching here. This is called what, say, orbital plate of the frontal bone, And this orbital plate of frontal bone, because the frontal bone is forming not just the roof, but is forming superior orbital margin also. And if you are forming the superior orbital margin, right at the middle of the superior orbital margin, there is a notch or sometimes even a foramen also. And once a notch or a foramen comes, again 3 questions. Name, because it is lying in the middle of the superior orbital margin, that's why its name is the supraorbital foramen. So this is supraorbital foramen, this one. Supraorbital foramen. Location, you see at the superior orbital margin. Sometimes even it's some part of it is like a foramen, but sometimes a bridge of the bone is broken here. It looks like a notch. You this time called the supraorbital. You say notch. It can be foramen. In some skulls or the older skulls, you see it will be notch also. So notch and foramen is the same thing. The supraorbital notch here. Now, which 2 compartments it will communicate? You just pass the needle through that, or you pass the wire through that, it will go into the orbit. Means you are going from the face or into the forehead also, because forehead is the part of the face also. Forehead is the part of face as well as of the scalp. So that means you can say this communicates the orbit with the face, or you can communicate with the orbit with the scalp also. So 3 questions will be actually solved here. This you are actually watching. So superior orbital margin is being formed also. At the same time, walls of the orbit is being formed, and in these walls you are watching the fissures and foramina also. And here you are watching actually the foramen, and number 1 foramen you have seen here. So see, this is what we call here the superior or the roof of your orbit, number 1. Another will be when you will come here into the lateral side. 10% of the lateral wall has been already formed by the frontal bone. This is called actually the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, but the rest of the lateral wall is being formed by the zygomatic bone. And zygomatic bone, you see this is the body of zygomatic. Z has been actually shown here. It's called the body of zygomatic, and inside when you are going here, this will be called the orbital surface or the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone. Means lateral wall, almost remaining 90% of the lateral wall is being formed here by orbital plate of zygomatic bone. This is called the orbital plate of zygomatic bone. This is here, and this zygomatic bone is forming. So it is zygomatic bone is forming not just the lateral orbital margin, but at the same time reflecting, you see, bending inside to form the lateral wall. But this lateral wall is forming the lateral wall, but it will not go and form the entire lateral wall up to the depth. You see that it will stop here. Means if it is stop here, means the rest of this will be in the lateral wall, in the rest of the lateral wall. I say it is forming the lateral wall obviously. You see, means lengthwise it is 90%. But depth wise it is not 90, it is not depth wise not reaching to the bottom here, but it will be actually reaching up to half of the bottom. You see, half means it will not reach the bottom, means halfway it will go and will stop. You see, it stops here. Means the rest of the lateral up to the bottom who is forming, another bone will intervene, and that another bone that is present here, this bone which has been actually made here, this is called the GW, this is the greater wing of SPH, this is called the sphenoid bone. This is called the greater wing of sphenoid. A very, very important bone that will be actually visible and will be present inside also. This is forming the lateral wall remaining portion where the zygomatic couldn't fill. Means zygomatic couldn't actually go deep into the maximum depth here. It reaches up to halfway deep, and remaining depth in fact will be reached by the greater wing of the sphenoid. So the lateral wall is being formed here by zygomatic bones, called the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone, and inside remaining will be filled by the greater wing of the sphenoid. And this is you are actually watching here. Now, if you have seen the lateral wall, in the lateral wall, not in the greater wing of the sphenoid, but in the zygomatic bone, on the lateral side there are 2 foramina. These foramina are not just the foramina. When you are actually passing something or wire, small wire through these foramina, very difficult, even in the original skull, it's very difficult to actually locate these foramina. There are foramina there, but usually they are filled with the connective tissue or something. You see there, usually they are closed. But when you will actually open them, you will pass through them, there is a canal, and that canal will guide you outside here over to the body of the zygomatic bone. One canal will open here very close to the temporal side. One canal will open here in the zygomatic body closer to the face. So one canal that is actually towards the temporal side, this is called zygomatico-temporal foramen. Very important, because from here the zygomatico-temporal nerve comes, and this is the nerve which carries the postganglionic parasympathetic fibers for the lacrimal glands for tearing. Actually tears come by virtue of this nerve. That's why we are actually giving some attention to this. This is called the zygomatico-facial, I say zygomatico-temporal foramen. This is zygomatico-temporal foramen. Another, I say, we have seen by now that you have seen a supraorbital foramen or a notch. First communication is this. Second communication in the lateral wall this time is zygomatico-temporal foramen, which is the outer limit of the zygomatico-temporal canal, whose other limit, you know, that the other extent is in the lateral wall of the orbit here. Means from orbit, some of the nerves, one nerve can enter into this canal, will appear under the face and will go here by the side of the lateral angle of your eye and will reach up to the scalp. And when it is passing by the side of your lateral side of the eye, and here is lying your lacrimal gland, will give the postganglionic parasympathetic fibers to the lacrimal gland. So this is called the zygomatico-temporal foramen, number 1. So this is now number 2, I say, after supraorbital foramen. This is the number 2. This is the second communication. After the second communication, you see zygomatico-temporal. Little below, it is another foramen in the lateral wall, which in fact opens here into the body of say zygomatic bone, very close here to the face. This is called zygomatico-facial foramen. Another nerve with the same name, zygomatico-facial. You see it is passing like this. Zygomatico-facial foramen. This is third communication. Both of them very easily you can ask yourself 3 questions, and 3 questions will be answered here. Name, location, and what passes through. That's a name, location, and what 2 compartments they are actually communicating. Bring it now. This was your lateral wall. Now when you are actually coming onto the floor now, floor very important again. It's a floor here. You see lateral wall is very, very tough because the zygomatic bone is a very tough bone. So your lateral wall is very tough here. We have told you that orbital plate is little weaker. But if the orbital plate is little weaker, when the orbital plate fractures, frontal lobe of the brain, which is lying just above that, it is actually gets injured, and then a problem will be there. And a frontal lobe, especially orbitofrontal cortex, will lead here to the personality problems here. So called the personality impairment. Like one of them is called the disinhibition. People do not know, say, the norms of the society. Means it is called a disinhibition. We will actually discuss it later. But you see, this is now the roof. This is the lateral wall, and now you are going into the floor. Floor almost half is being formed here by the zygomatic bone. Same. This is actually going into the floor also. But remaining floor means a medial part of the floor is being formed by this bone. This bone is called the maxilla. So the maxilla is forming the medial, I say, inferior orbital margin also, and then bends inside to form the rest of the floor. Which floor? The lateral part of, I say, medial part of the floor. And medial part of the floor, you see, this is called the maxilla, and this will be called as what? This will be called as this one. This is called orbital plate of the maxilla. This is called the orbital plate of maxilla. Orbital plate of the maxilla, you will see this is forming the floor. Which portion? You see medial part of the floor, because the lateral part of the floor is being formed here by the zygomatic bone. So this is lateral part, I see medial part of the floor is being formed by the orbital plate. If you will actually watch the orbital plate, halfway along the orbital plate you see here a groove. That groove's name here, this groove which you are actually seeing here is called the infraorbital groove. This is called infraorbital groove. You are watching this groove. It's a groove. Because some neurovascular bundle, especially the nerve, is passing through that. This is actually accommodated by this groove. This groove is called this one. This groove is called infraorbital groove. Okay, this is infraorbital groove. This is up to halfway length of the floor that is formed by the maxilla part. But after that, the groove finishes. Even the nerve disappears. Nerve is not disappeared because bones comes over the nerve. If the bones comes over the nerve, that will not be any longer a groove. This will be called as a canal now, because it has been bridged by the bone here. So that means if, for example, you are actually watching here, you see if this is here is a groove, is here nerve. When the bone comes over it, so this groove which was half groove and now half it will be the canal. This canal will be called infraorbital canal. So you see the next will be here, because it is half is hidden now, nerve is there, but half is hidden. You will call this as a infraorbital canal. Okay. After this infraorbital canal have been traversed, you see this nerve will emerge now, emerge on the face. Face means from where? From canal, foramen here, which is lying very close in inferior here to the middle part of the infraorbital margin in the face. A very important foramen. This foramen is called infraorbital foramen. See, this was supraorbital foramen. Just a line here, vertical line here, at 180 degree they both are actually lying. This is called infraorbital foramen. This is infraorbital foramen, and this infraorbital foramen actually is lodging or housing here a nerve that's called infraorbital nerve. Very important nerve, is the continuation of the maxillary nerve. And when it is actually coming out here, it forms here a bunch of the branches here, and these bunch of the branches will actually supply the inferior eyelid, will supply even your superior lip, and will supply even the little side of even nose also. Not here going to the zygomatic side, but this actually is a bunch of the nerves. That's why even in orbital fractures, this nerve is trapped here. If the nerve is trapped here, so you will actually lose the sensation up to even upper lip now. So you will see that this is actually the nerve, and here if the nerve is emerging out of your infraorbital foramen, if you are putting the anesthetic solution here, even up to the upper lip it will be desensitized, and you can do here the upper lip surgeries also. This will be actually in orbital injuries, this nerve can be here. And another will be, for example, this is the floor where you are actually watching. So in the floor especially, you are watching some important thing here that is called, that is infraorbital foramen. So after that, the fourth thing will be the infraorbital foramen, fourth communication. But you see, infraorbital foramen was not just foramen, it was canal, it was a groove. So these things are there, but we are discussing only one thing, that is called the infraorbital foramen. This is something we are actually seeing in the floor now. Now the floor has been formed here, okay, by zygomatic as well as maxilla. But when you are coming here to the towards your say medial side here, medial side, when you are actually forming here the medial orbital margin, though some of the orbital margin has been formed by the frontal, but the rest of it is being formed here by the maxilla. Maxilla is forming the lateral, medial orbital, from medial side, medial orbital margin has been formed by this, but it doesn't bend inside to form the medial wall. This time, for the first time, the bone forming the margin, it is not forming the wall also. Usually, see, frontal bone forming the superior orbital margin, bends inside to form the roof. On the lateral side, zygomatic bone forming the lateral orbital margin, bends inside to form the lateral wall. Vein is a maxilla also forming the inferior orbital margin, bends inside to form the floor. But the same maxilla, it is forming here the medial orbital margin, but is not bends inside to form the medial wall. Means medial wall is totally deficient. I say not deficient, not formed by any facial bone, will be formed by other bones now. Other bones means say orbital margin, up to orbital margin, true. It is now up to orbital margin, this is true, that is actually your maxilla. Which part of maxilla? Frontal, this is called the frontal process, this is a nasal process of maxilla. But inside it is not forming the medial wall. Medial wall is formed inside, when you are going to the medial side, inside the medial wall will be almost 30%, it will be formed by this bone whose name is the lacrimal bone. So this bone is called the lacrimal bone. And lacrimal bone, if you feel the lacrimal bone, there is a vertical groove is present there. And that vertical groove or depression which is present there, this actually accommodates your lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct. This is called the lacrimal groove. And from the lacrimal groove, you know that is a continuation, and here the nasolacrimal duct is lying there, and nasolacrimal duct will come down here, will open here into the lower part of the lateral nasal cavity. That's why the tears which in fact been collected by the nasolacrimal lacrimal sac will come into the nasolacrimal duct and will be drained into the nose here. And this is what we call here the lacrimal bone. Now this is lacrimal groove, but if you will actually see here, that I forgot here, you see one more thing which you can see in this area. If you are feeling the superior orbital margin, the most lateral portion, frontal bone, and frontal bone goes inside to form the roof. And the roof, this portion, the lateral part of the roof, we say, lateral part of the roof, when you actually feel very close here to the inferior, superior orbital margin, there is a depression. This depression, this time here, it is called the lacrimal fossa. This one here. I am making blue dots here. Here it will be lacrimal fossa. This is called lacrimal fossa. A lacrimal fossa, it will accommodate lacrimal gland. Lacrimal gland is lying here, and when the secretion is actually coming from the lacrimal gland, this is poured here into the conjunctival sac. And from here it will be during blinking, all this lacrimal secretion in fact will be moistening the entire eyeball, and it will come here into the lateral side. When lacrimal sac is wetting, it will suck this and will put it into the nasolacrimal duct to drain it into the lateral nasal wall. And this is what we call here the lacrimal fossa. Come back here again to the medial wall. In the medial wall, I told you there is 30% formed by the lacrimal gland. Remaining you see 80%, more than even say more than 70%, it is formed by this E, this green bone, that is called the ethmoid bone. So you can say 30% by this and 30% by the lacrimal bone, more than 65% by the ethmoid bone. So who will form the 5%? 5% will be this red color which I have actually shown you, this one. This you should not ignore. This bone is called a palatine bone. This is orbital surface of the palatine bone. This is the orbital surface or orbital part of the palatine bone. This is forming very little, 5%, less than 5% of your medial wall. But I told you that 30% is being formed here by the lacrimal bone, and this is the ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone forming most of your medial wall. A very brittle bone, you see that. And for example, in orbital fractures, usually this bone, it's very brittle, so this bone fractures. And with the bone fractures here, so on your medial side, if any extraocular muscle is there, will be trapped. Yeah, your medial, say rectus muscle, it will be trapped here. When it will be trapped here, and when you are moving your eyeballs here, this eyeball, due to your medial rectus entrapment, this will not move, but your other eye will move normally. So that means double image will be formed here. That is called diplopia. Means as a result of injury to the orbit, some important symptoms actually, or some important signs will develop. Number one, I say diplopia is there. Loss of sensation in your face and other things will be there. And with the movement of the eyes will be affected here. Now in this especially, I told you that it's called the palatine bone and this is ethmoid bone. And now you will see in this especially in the ethmoid side, means in the medial side, there are two foramina here very close here in the ethmoid bone, or in the junction between the ethmoid and the frontal. This one which you are actually seeing here, this one, this is called anterior ethmoidal foramen. Anterior ethmoidal foramen. This will be, you can say, your fifth communication. Name anterior ethmoidal foramen. This will be called posterior ethmoidal foramen. This is sixth. Same three questions. Name, location, you have seen the medial wall of your orbit, and two compartments which they communicate. You pass the wire through that, you will see that most of this, if it is in the lateral medial wall of your orbit, means it will surely be the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, because next structure is the nasal cavity, so it will be lateral wall of your nasal cavity. Means any nerve which will pass through these foramina will come on other side into the nasal cavity. These are anterior posterior ethmoidal nerves. So you see it is the ethmoidal portions here. So these are the, means almost you see 6 major fissures of foramina you have seen now. Now out of these 6 now, 3 more which we are going to discuss now, they are the most important, even more important than these 6 can be. Number 1, if you see that this here, I told you that medial wall, your roof was formed here by what? Orbital plate of frontal bone. It went inside. It went inside, almost whole roof has been formed by this. But in the depth, 10% is not formed by this. It deficiency is filled by here. Again, sphenoid bone, but this time which one? This is called here the lesser wing of sphenoid. This has been actually given here LW. This is lesser wing. I am giving slash SPH. This is sphenoid. This is lesser wing of sphenoid. Greater wing of sphenoid already we have seen. This is greater wing of sphenoid is forming here the lateral wall's remaining portion, and here this is the greater wing of sphenoid which is forming the roof's remaining portion, 10%. And you know that greater and lesser wing of sphenoid, they are separate from each other. You have seen this in the in your middle cranial fossa. Lesser and greater wing, they are forming actually a big fissure here, and that fissure is called the superior orbital fissure. You can see the superior orbital fissure, and you know that from superior orbital fissure almost 4 nerves are passing. Third is passing from here, fourth also here, V1 also, and sixth also. This is superior orbital fissure. So this will be called the superior orbital fissure. So that means this is a, if you are actually going here inside, we have already told you, roof is being formed here by 90% by your orbital plate of the frontal bone, but the remaining 10% in the depth is formed here by the lesser wing of the sphenoid. And you have already seen that the lateral wall, which was 50% inside, is being formed here by the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone, and the rest of this will be actually formed here by the greater wing of the sphenoid. And we have already seen in the lateral, say in the middle cranial fossa, lesser wing of sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoids, they are not fused with each other, they are little separate. A big fissure has been created, and that fissure is called the supraorbital fissure. A very important here, supraorbital fissure is this. A supraorbital fissure name, and it communicates the orbit with the middle cranial fossa, and you have already seen this is present as a gap between the lesser wing and the greater wing of sphenoid. When the lesser and greater wing is present here also, their aspects, surely the fissure will be present here as well. That's why we call them supraorbital fissure. I told you that this is the number 2 or the second most congested fissure or the congested space present in the cranial cavity after foramen magnum. This is second in line. You can see it not president, at least it is the prime minister. You can see more than 7, 8 contents are passing through there. And similarly, a dozen of the contents pass through the foramen magnum. So you are watching here, this is the third nerve, the fourth, the fifth and sixth. Fifth means first division, and this is passing through the supraorbital fissure. Some more things also. So this is supraorbital fissure, and you have seen here this this superior. Coming down here, we told you this coming down again, greater wing of the sphenoid forming the lateral wall, and immediately when come onto the floor is being formed here by the maxilla. This is the sphenoid's greater wing, and here is the maxilla. Maxilla and sphenoid, they are not at good terms with each other, so there is having a gap. And this gap you have seen already in the infratemporal fossa and pterygoplatine fossa, similar gap, and here also you see this gap will appear on its orbital view also. So this is what we call here the gap, and this gap is again going into the fissure that is called through this fissure this comes also into the orbit. That's why this is also called the orbital fissure, but this time we will call it infraorbital fissure. So this will be our 8th communication is this is called the infraorbital fissure. And this infraorbital fissure is communicating the orbit with behind what? Infratemporal fossa or pterygoplatine fossa. Because this infraorbital fissure has 90% portion will open into the bigger infratemporal fossa, and medial very small portion will open into the pterygoplatine fossa, because it is in continuity. So this is our 8th communication. Now if you are actually coming here, lesser wing of the sphenoid, you remember, lesser wing of the sphenoid medially ends at the anterior clinoid process. And anteromedial to the anterior clinoid process was lying here a canal, that's name is the optic canal. If it's optic canal, we have passed the needle through the optic canal, if it came into the orbit, means in the orbit is also present this. And where it should be present? Very close to the lesser wing of the sphenoid's most medial extent, that is called the anterior clinoid process. You are watching this also. So this is the optic canal here. Optic canal, optic, as the name suggests, it transmits optic nerve. And by the way, artery also, the ophthalmic artery. So this is what we call here the optic canal. So here our 9th communication is the optic canal. I say optic canal. So 9 communications, you see 9 openings in your orbit from the different portions. So mostly they are coming from your cranial cavity, and some are coming from your pterygoplatine fossa, which is on the back side, or infratemporal fossa also, and they are going here, either they will stay there or they come out here, either they will go to the forehead or coming here into the face, different portions here, even up to the upper lip also. And surely fissure is there, oral fissure, so they will not go here to the lower lip. For the lower lip, you need some more things. So here, this is what we call here the orbit, bony orbit. It's various communications, different bones which are forming their walls, and here these structures will be here. Now you can communicate because you have already done the cranial cavity. So in any cranial cavity portion, for example, you have done already your pterygoplatine fossa or infratemporal fossa. So your cranial cavity done, pterygoplatine infratemporal fossa done, in front is the orbit has been done, and here towards this medial side is the nasal cavity also. These things you have actually done, and now you can connect them, and in a series you can generate their correspondence here. Any blood vessel which will, or any nerve which will leave the anterior cranial fossa or middle cranial fossa, will leave foramen rotundum for example, will come here down, will enter into the next, this is the pterygoplatine fossa in the base of the skull. If you have entered in the base of the skull in the pterygoplatine fossa, you want to go to the orbit, yes, you can go here into the anterior wall at the top, supraorbital fissure, infraorbital fissure, go through that. You will run here. Where? In the groove. Which groove? Is the infraorbital groove. Then in the canal will come out of your infraorbital foramen, spread here onto the face. So that is from cranial cavity, passing through your middle cranial fossa, pterygoplatine fossa, orbit, face. 4 regions if you have actually done, join them together. One nerve can travel like here, and you can easily understand if any injury in their passage, if they are having, you can consider or you can correlate them, the defects which actually appear out of this. Now this topic is eye, and we have
actually divided the eye into different compartments, the different components here. And the first component is the bony orbit. Means we have to see here how the bony orbit is constituted, who forms its orbital margins, who forms the floor, roof, anterior and medial walls, the bones, and in between various bones, what are the fissures, foramina, are the canals, and what structure has been transmitted through that. So we have to have some idea about that. Now in this bony orbit, you are seeing this whole structure of the bony orbits, various parts also. You see its margin, like this supraorbital margin. We have its medial orbital margin, then medial orbital margin is completed by the maxilla. Then same maxilla is forming bit of the inferior orbital margin also. Rest of the inferior orbital margin is being completed by the zygomatic bone. And zygomatic bone continuously it is forming most of the lateral orbital margin, and the rest of the lateral orbital margin is being completed by the frontal bone. So we have got basically 4 sides, but we have got 3 bones: frontal, the maxilla, and the zygomatic. So they are contributing in multiple sides here. But they are not just forming the various margins, but they are in fact bending themselves inside here also to form the roof. For example, if the frontal bone bends inside, it will form the roof. You will see that maxilla bends inside to form the floor. Same zygomatic bone bends inside to form the floors, rest of the part. And most of the part of the lateral wall is being formed here by the same zygomatic bone. But on the medial side, it's a little complicated, because here this maxilla which is present and forming here the lateral as a medial orbital margin, this doesn't bend inside to form the medial orbital wall. The medial orbital wall is formed by certain other bones, like here this is called the lacrimal bone, this is the ethmoid bone, a little bit the palatine bone also it is forming here. So this medial wall is a little bit complicated. Watch it here, various walls here. This is number 1 is the roof. Now in the roof you see various bones forming, especially the frontal bone is forming most of the roof. When the most of the roof, you know that is forming the frontal bone, but where the frontal bone doesn't reach, some other bones will contribute. And here some other bone being this very small piece of the bone, this will be actually forming the rest of the roof, though most of the roof is being formed here by the frontal bone. This see here, bones forming here. So most of it is being formed here by frontal bone, which is forming the superiorbital margin as well as a little bit lateral as well as medial. So it is forming a little bit of a medial wall as well as little bit of lateral wall, but most of its roof will be formed by the frontal bone. Call this one as this one green color. This is called orbital plate of frontal bone. But you see this orbital plate of frontal bone is forming most of it. But where the orbital plate of the frontal bone can't reach, this piece is formed here by another bone. This is called the lesser wing of sphenoid. I mean this piece of the bone will be called the lesser wing of sphenoid. So you see this is lesser wing of sphenoid. So this is the lesser wing of sphenoid which you are watching here. This is forming hardly, I said 10% of your roof is formed by that, because the frontal bone couldn't reach there. And if this is here, you see this is lesser wing of sphenoid, and we have already told you that this lesser wing of sphenoid finishes at the here from cranial side. We have seen here this is the anterior clinoid process, and anterior medial to the anterior clinoid process there was a foramen that is called the canal. We call it the optic canal. So one passage is this, an optic canal, name optic canal, and present anterior medial to the anterior clinoid process, communicating anterior cranial fossa with the orbit here. A structure transmitting, you know already, optic nerve and ophthalmic artery. So this was actually the roof here. Which passages? Already we told you that passage number 1, it was the optic canal. Right now you have seen. But another will be when the lesser wing of sphenoid is present here. Okay. But after that, when the greater wing come, greater wing of sphenoid, this is a part of the lateral wall. But this is greater wing come because lesser wing is away from the greater wing by means of a fissure here. This fissure is called superiorbital fissure. Means this superiorbital fissure is also a passage in the roof. So see this also. Superiorbital fissure. Name superiorbital fissure. Location, a gap between lesser wing and the greater wing of sphenoid. Communication, middle cranial fossa with the orbit. A structure transmitted through that, many of them. The third nerve, the fourth, the first division, that is called the ophthalmic nerve, the sixth nerve, and the superior ophthalmic vein, etc. So superiorbital fissure it was there. See again the superiorbital fissure, a gap between the lesser wing and the greater wing. Another passage is the supraorbital foramen. You are watching here very close to your supraorbital margin, which is in fact guiding you to the forehead, and the scalp is the supraorbital foramen. And supraorbital foramen location you have seen already. and if you are passing the wire through that, it will come here into the roof of the orbit. So it means it communicates the orbit with the forehead and also to the scalp. So supraorbital foramen location you have already seen, and communication and structure passing through will be the same: supraorbital artery, vein and nerve. See again the floor. The floor is being formed here by partly by zygomatic and partly by the inferior orbital margin, partly by the zygomatic and partly by the maxilla. So floor will be half will be formed by the zygomatic and half will be formed by the maxilla. So see, it is half formed by zygomatic and half is formed by the maxilla bone. You are watching here. So bones forming, already you see here, green color you have been shown. This is the maxilla bone. So orbital plate of the maxilla you call it. So it is the orbital plate of maxilla which is being formed here. And this one, the lateral side part, lateral part of this will be formed here by the orbital plate of zygomatic bone. This was the orbital plate of maxilla. But this is difference here. Orbital plate of zygomatic bone, it is smooth. But in the zygomatic orbital plate of the maxilla, it has the groove, which is the groove, and later the groove finishes here. We will tell you this. What are the passages? One passage, you know that already we told you here that there is a inferior orbital fissure. The reason is that because when the maxilla finishes here, this is the maxilla, this orbital plate of the maxilla, and here this is the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone. Okay, this is maxilla. But after the maxilla, when here was present the greater wing of a sphenoid, and the sphenoid actually is the bone which doesn't have a good terms with the maxilla, there is a gap. A gap is created. This gap is called inferior orbital fissure. So this is inferior orbital fissure you are watching here. So in the floor you can say there is inferior orbital fissure, and beyond the inferior orbital fissure on the back side, more laterally 90% you will go into the infratemporal fossa, and here more 10% here, this more medially you will go into the pterygoplatean fossa. Means you can pass from the inferior orbital fissure to the either pterygoplatean or to the inferior orbital fissure. Sorry, through inferior orbital fissure you will pass either through infratemporal fossa or you will go to the pterygoplatean fossa, and you are coming into the orbit here. So location, name, location, and it's a communication to compartments here, and passing through structures will be many, like infraorbital nerve, part of the maxillary nerve will pass through that, artery also, vein also. Then you coming here, inferior orbital fissure, again you are watching here between the maxilla and others. But you see, this is a maxilla part forming a medial half of the floor of your orbit. In the maxilla you see this green color. This is called inferior orbital groove. This groove is present in the half of the floor, in the rest of the half of floor is not present. So if any structure will pass through that, it will be visible, and after that this structure will not be visible. The reason is that because there is a bridge of bone overlying it. So there will be no line, no more a groove. Here it will be a canal. Here it will be a canal. We call it inferior orbital canal. Here you call it inferior orbital groove. And this groove is actually inferior orbital groove, and behind it is communicating with the infraorbital, infraorbital fissure is called inferior orbital fissure. And from inferior orbital fissure it went into the infratemporal fossa. Means if any structure will leave the infratemporal fossa, will pass through the inferior orbital fissure, will pass into the inferior orbital groove, will come into the inferior orbital canal, and after that it will actually come here into the infraorbital foramen to pass here onto the face. And this is the course of your maxillary nerve. I would say maxillary nerve or maxillary artery, etc. This is the area we are watching here. This is the floor, various parts here. So infraorbital foramen, you are watching this infraorbital foramen. So the thing will leave, the structure will leave now the inferior orbital fissure, then pass through the canal, I say through the groove, then through the canal, and now come out to the foramen. But before that it was present in pterygoplatean fossa or infratemporal fossa. Then we are bringing the medial wall. Medial wall, you see, its medial wall margin is formed by surely the nasal process of the maxilla and also the frontal bone. And medial wall is formed here, upper portion, okay, 10% by the maxilla, I said by the frontal bone, but the rest of the medial wall is formed by this blue color, this orange color, and very little this green color also by this. So see this one. Up to here, green, this is the margin only, but inside it was formed by this blue, this orange, and this green. These are the medial walls, separate bones. The blue color which you see, this is called the palatine lacrimal bone. This is lacrimal bone. So see here, maxilla up to margins only, but inside this is this. You call this bone as the lacrimal bone. So lacrimal bone is forming this. A lacrimal bone, see already in this lacrimal bone, if you are actually watching, so and this is see this lacrimal. So in this lacrimal bone, you are watching this groove. This is called lacrimal groove, which has got a raised crest in front and raised crest in front and behind. This is called the posterior lacrimal crest. This is called the anterior lacrimal crest. In between there is a groove. That is called the lacrimal groove. This lacrimal groove that lodges the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct. And after that, you are actually watching where the lacrimal bone finishes here. See, when the lacrimal bone finishes here, after you see this lacrimal groove and this crest, anterior posterior, you will come across another bone. This is called the orbital plate of ethmoid bone. You are watching this. On the top of this, you have got this foramen. You have got this foramen also. These are called anterior ethmoidal foramen. This is called posterior ethmoidal foramen. These are two passages again in the medial wall. And after that, you see very small bone. You are actually watching this one here. This is called the palatine bone. So what are the passages? Passage you already see. This is called, this one is called the anterior ethmoidal foramen, communicating the nasal cavity with the orbit. And we have even the posterior ethmoidal foramen also, this one. So you see this, anterior ethmoidal and posterior ethmoidal foramen. And these are the foramina which are guiding you into the nasal cavity. Come to the lateral wall. Bones forming the lateral wall, you see it is almost all zygomatic bone. Little bit okay, frontal also, but almost all like zygomatic. And this will forming the lateral orbital margin, as well as it reflects and bends inside to form the most of its lateral wall. But lateral wall, not in the depth. Hardly it will be, you see that it will be forming, say half. But the remaining half it will be formed here at the greater ventral. So zygomatic and sphenoid bone they are forming. Here up to here zygomatic, but later on you will see this. Up to here zygomatic. Up to here is zygomatic. But later on, you see zygomatic here, orbital plate of the zygomatic. But later on, more deeper, it will be this. This is called the greater ring of the sphenoid. That's why I tell you that the greater ring of the sphenoid is very important bone, because above it is separate from the lesser ring of the sphenoid to form here a superior orbital fissure, and below it is separate from your maxilla to form here inferior orbital fissure. Superior orbital fissure that guides you into the middle cranial fossa, and inferior orbital fissure that guides you into the infratemporal arterioplatine fossa. Okay, see the passage in the lateral wall, not too many of them, but we have actually inside we have two small passages here, important again. One passage will guide you here into this foramen, which is more towards the face. This is called zygomatico-facial foramen, and one passage, one canal which will guide you here in this side here, that will guide you to the temple here. This is called the zygomatico-temporal foramen. This will be the zygomatico-temporal. This one is zygomatico-temporal foramen. So we have a canal here like this. So zygomatico-temporal artery vein and nerve pass through there, and zygomatico-facial artery vein and nerve pass through this. Zygomatico-temporal nerve very important, because zygomatico-temporal nerve contains postganglionic parasympathetic fibers, which can in fact finally be carried to the lacrimal nerve to supply here in this lacrimal fossa the lacrimal gland. We have forgotten this here, because in the roof, in the lateral side, there is a depression that is called a lacrimal fossa, and that lacrimal fossa in the roof will lodges here the lacrimal gland.